The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it is almost trite to say, but profoundly important to remember that governing is about priorities. Governing is about choices. A majority government is in a unique position in this regard. A majority government can control the parliamentary agenda. It can research whatever issue it wishes. A majority government has access to full information and the resources of our civil service and departments. A majority government can put whatever legislation it wishes before this House. Now today, for all Canadians watching and who care about what's going on in their federal parliament, this government has put C-27 before us today. And this is what this bill does. This bill requires every First Nations, except those with self-governing regimes, to produce the following: an audited annual consolidated financial statement, a separate annual schedule of remuneration that details the remuneration, salaries, wages, commissions, bonuses, fees, honoraria, dividends and expenses, including transportation, accommodation, meals, hospitality and incidentals, paid by the First Nation and any entity controlled by the First Nation to its chief and each of the councillors in their professional and personal capacities. It requires an auditor's written report respecting the consolidated financial statements, an auditor's report respecting the schedule of remuneration. For each of these four documents, this bill requires each First Nation to provide the document upon request to any of its members within 120 days, and it requires the band to publish this information and documents on its website and retain it on its website for 10 years. Furthermore, the Minister must publish the documents on the website of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. Now, failure of a First Nation to comply with these requirements enables any First Nation member to apply for a court order to the Superior Court, any person, including the Minister, to apply for a court order to the Superior Court, the Minister to develop a so-called appropriate action plan to remedy the breach, the Minister may withhold any funds to the First Nation, or the Minister may terminate any funding agreement with that First Nation. Now, Mr. Speaker, as all Canadians can easily see, this bill deals with First Nations. Now, consider this. Consider all of the issues facing First Nations people on reserve and in urban areas today. We have poverty rates facing First Nations that are dramatically above non-Aboriginals. We have incarceration rates, both men and in particular women, far exceeding the percentage of population that First Nations compose in our country. We have reserves across this country without safe drinking water. We have reserves across this country without proper housing, where multi-generations of families, sometimes 10 to 20 people, are crammed together living in houses built for 5. We have reserves without proper schools in this country. We have substandard and fewer education dollars and outcomes for Aboriginals than we have for non-Aboriginals. Across this country in First Nations reserves, in urban areas and non-reserves, we have epidemics of suicide, drug abuse and domestic violence. We have people in this country, in Canada today, Aboriginals, that are living in third world conditions. Canadians had to see this past summer the prospects of the Red Cross sending in emergency aid to Canadians living on a reserve in Canada. Now, the conditions on the ground, Mr. Speaker, are deplorable.
We tabled 3 motions. They dealt with the substantive elements of C-27. This member has not just deviated, he's gone completely off the map in terms of what this House was intended or contemplated speaking to today. And I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, to make a determination in these regards. It is a point of order.
Order. As I've said earlier, that it is the practice in this place that all honourable members are given significant latitude in terms of addressing the matter before the House. Having said that, again, I will once again take the opportunity to remind all honourable members that that there is an agenda and what is before the House, if they could address it with their remarks. The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the member from Kenora has been wrong twice now in his order, and only he would stand up, and this government would stand up and say that talking about the conditions of First Nations people in this country has nothing to do with the bill that deals with remuneration and disclosure of people in First Nations. That's something else. Now, the legal reality facing First Nations in this country, Mr. Speaker, is thus. We're dealing with an outmoded Indian Act, a paternalistic, ineffective vestige of colonialism. Despite billions of dollars spent by the Department of Indian Affairs, we have poor outcomes. We have bands being forced to go to court repeatedly to enforce basic rights over and over again. And we have an appalling record of government violating treaties and failing to negotiate treaties with dozens of bands in Canada who have never ceded their rights, like they have in British Columbia, or signed a binding treaty nation to nation with Canada. Now, given all of these serious, critical facts, what does this government, the Conservatives, decide is their priority to deal with when we talk about First Nations? They want to go after what chiefs and councillors make. Now, we've done a little bit of research here. The average salary for chiefs of bands in this country is $60,000. The average salary for band councillors in this country is $31,000. 50% of chiefs of bands in this country earn less than $60,000 a year, and only 5% of chiefs in this country earn more than $100,000. 50% of First Nations in this country have no internet access, period, but this government, the Conservatives, think the priority is to require bands to post financial information of what their chiefs and councillors say on their websites, instead of being concerned with the hundreds of thousands of First Nations having no access to internet access. Really, this government, the Conservatives, that talk about accountability of First Nations is absolutely appalling. They sign trade deals negotiated behind closed doors and in secret, and then talk about wanting accountability for First Nations bands. They have the Minister of Immigration who spent $750,000 of taxpayer dollars to conduct media monitoring of his own image. But the Conservatives want to crack down on First Nations chiefs to make sure that taxpayer dollars are not wasted. This government brings in omnibus legislation that deprives parliamentarians of our ability to properly scrutinize laws, most of which have zero to do with the budget. But this government wants to talk about accountability. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is absolutely a joke. The New Democrats are opposed to this legislation because it was imposed on First Nations without consultation, and it runs counter to the Conservative pronouncements at the time of the Crown First Nations gathering that they would strive to work together with First Nations. The inclusion of reporting of own source revenues under the provision of federal legislation is unprecedented. Practically speaking, the requirement to publish detailed consolidated financial statements of First Nation-controlled businesses may undermine their competitive abilities and financial success. Now, while the stated aims of Bill C-27 are to increase transparency to First Nations citizens, the requirement for public posting on a First Nations website, along with posting on the AANDC website, and the allowance for any person, not just a member of a First Nation, to apply to court for a disclosure of financial statement and salary report is an absolute violation of privacy. And this is the government that took away the long-form census because it thought that it was a violation of privacy to ask Canadians anonymously to disclose how many bedrooms they had in their house. You hear them clapping, but they then don't care about forcing First Nations bands to publish information of their expenses on a website without any concern for their privacy whatsoever. Now, Mr. Speaker, the NDP does not support this bill. We believe that this bill does not do anything to increase accountability of First Nations governments to their people. It applies standards that are greater than those for elected officials in all other jurisdictions, or many other jurisdictions, I should say. Now, the New Democrats want the government to work collaboratively with First Nations to improve governance. Instead, we see the Conservatives cutting funding to institutions supporting governance, including the First Nations Statistical Institute and the National Centre for First Nations Governance. We believe that changes to how audited statements are presented to First Nations do not need legislation. It can be a requirement of funding arrangements that the Department has each First Nation government signed. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude with something that the Assembly of First Nations said. This is their quote. We all know what the problems are. They are not exorbitant salaries. They are decades of paternalism that have placed many First Nation leaders in a position where they are responsible for implementing decisions, but where the ultimate power to make those decisions rests with the federal government. That is, under the Indian Act. Not only does this continue to be patently inappropriate, it remains a recipe for poor outcomes. Mr. Speaker, instead of this government playing politics and doing the bidding for their buddies at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, instead of making scapegoats of some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the society, why won't this government bring forth legislation to address the very real problems of facing First Nations in this country and bring them up to the standards that every Canadian should expect? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.